Okay, I've started the recording.
Cool.
So, there's probably lots of wins. It's probably not going to be great afterwards. It's really bad I transcribed it. But I'm Neil Crawford, and I'm with Josiah here, and Josiah's puppy, Johnny. Hi, Johnny. He's not going to say hi. So, Josiah, essentially, Josiah Lopez-Wild,
Yep.
for the record.
That's me.
Essentially, I want to hear from you about what made you want to shift your focus from philosophy of mathematics to AI alignment. Before we get into that specifically, I want some context first. So I was wondering first, what were you doing before you came to LPS?
How far back?
I was thinking maybe from undergrad, or if there's
Okay,
anything
yeah.
worth talking about from before.
From before. So I mean, I went into undergrad wanting to be a math and physics major. I specifically wanted to do astrophysics, like of the theoretical sort. And this was because I was in this like science, math, technology, like academy thing in high school. It was like a little subcomponent of my high school where we took like accelerated courses. And for a while I wanted to be an engineer, and I took physics, and I was like, wow, theory is really great. I kind of just want to do physics. When I went to undergrad, 18-year-old Josiah was not ready to work hard, and I mostly just sort of blew off my studies. I got pretty bad grades, and so then I was like, well, maybe math and physics isn't for me. Turns out math is just fine, and I was just not studying.
Okay.
But I didn't know this at the time, and so I switched to philosophy because I took a couple of like first-year seminars on Plato and on the early moderns, and I really liked it because of it just being sort of general theory, just sort of like how do you answer sort of foundational questions about. I think I remember the first questions that got me were like, what is time? What is causation? Because I hadn't read Pearl. Stuff like that. That seemed sort of beyond the reach of, your normal scientific disciplines. So that was where I started. I ended up taking a lot of logic, and that ended up being one of the main subjects that I was interested in undergrad. And then I left Northwestern, and I went to Wisconsin, Milwaukee to do my master's in philosophy. And there, the faculty is not very sort of like logic or math heavy. Like they had one philosopher of math, and he was really more of a philosopher of science. And so I mostly took sort of history and metaphysics courses. And I mean, it was really good. I liked my time at Milwaukee. I think mostly studying metaphysics convinced me that it's not the subject for me.
Okay.
And so I gave up on it pretty quickly. Yeah, and then I applied out to PhDs, and I happened to get into here. I applied here originally because I wanted to work with Penn Matty and do philosophy of math. And then I had thought initially that I was probably more inclined to do like philosophical work rather than mathematical, just because I had stopped doing math so early on. But then when I came for the visit weekend, I met, the students here who are all doing really incredible work, and I was really influenced by like the philosophy of physics people and people like Daniel Naden, who were doing sort of like mathematically very sophisticated work on topics that I thought were important. And so when I went home, this was just a couple weeks before the beginning of the pandemic, and my roommate and I had been watching sort of what was happening in China, and I think at that time Italy. And we were like, oh, things could get bad. So I looked at the undergrad syllabi of like what math majors would have had to study at Northwestern, and then I went and found books and checked them all out. So I had like a big stack of math books, and then I went home for spring break, and then lockdown happened, so I ended up staying at my parents' house for like 5 months after that. So I had nothing to do because I was at the end of my master's, so pretty much all I did was study math all day, because I couldn't even leave the house because it was spring in Michigan, which is cold.
Even though your degree was in philosophy?
Yeah.
And you hadn't finished it at that time?
I hadn't finished my master's yet, but I'd nearly finished it. So my thesis was really just the writing sample that I turned in the fall. And my advisor thought it was already done. Like I didn't need to change anything to it. So I was sort of just skating through the end of the master's. Like I was in a course, but I wasn't really doing much for it. So I pretty much just studied math all day. I think I studied like linear algebra, some more abstract algebra like group and field theory. I kind of struggled through an analysis text, did some geometry,
And why were you doing all of this? Math stuff?
So I had resolved that I wanted to go to LPS.
Okay.
Of the places that I'd gotten into, it just seemed the most exciting. But I definitely felt intimidated by the fact that it seems like people were doing like real math and science here. And I was like, well, damn, my philosophy background's just not going to cut it.
Especially when reading Penn Maddie's stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I was like, I was convinced that she was doing like a good kind of philosophy of math, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I was not interested in doing. But I needed to know more math in order to do it. So that was just what I did over the pandemic. No, Johnny, you can't get up here. Yeah, so this became a very long-winded story, but that's how I ended up into LPS and doing math research, which was probably, I mean, it's probably not very surprising given that like I always loved math, and it was really just sort of like the fact that I did so poorly at the beginning of undergrad that pushed me away from it. But that was really more of a confidence thing rather than it seems like an ability thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then now you've built up that confidence, but you always had that ability.
Yeah. Math was always my best subject, and so like when I went to undergrad, I got placed into this like accelerated proof-based sequence that was intended for people who wanted to become math majors, so like getting used to abstract proof-based mathematics, which they don't teach in high school. And I thought that my normal routine of high school, where I like didn't study, just sort of listened in lectures and then magically got everything right, I thought that this would still work, and it obviously does not. So, yeah.
Cool.
So now,
great.
yeah. So then I came here to do math stuff.
Yeah, and so you came here before having heard about AI safety.
Yeah.
When did you first come across AI safety?
It had to have been a conversation with Daniel, right? So like most of this came through conversations with Daniel.
In your first year of LPS?
Yeah. So probably, I mean, knowing Daniel, it was probably very, not long after I met him. He tends to bring it up. I don't really remember the first conversation, but I do remember, so I hung out with him a lot over the visit weekend, and we became friends. And then when I actually moved out here, we would hang out pretty regularly. And I think at first we mostly just talked about like our interests, and I expressed a lot of interest in like logic and foundations of math. I've always really liked sort of overlap topics of computer science. Like I really like computability theory. And I had been studying, at the time I had just started self-teaching category theory, and category theory gets used a lot in contemporary computer science. So I was seeing a lot of these connections, and I knew that Daniel had this like computer science background, so I talked to him about it. And at some point he must have brought up alignment. I remember distinctly that he brought up the sequences at some point. I started reading those pretty early on in my first year, like maybe November.
This is the Eliezer Yudkowsky sequences.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Rationality from AI to Zombies. So these hooked me a lot. Like I just always had them open on my phone, and I would get up in the morning and like make my coffee and read like 5 of the posts before I started working. And then anytime I had downtime, like if I was, like waiting for something to happen, or if I had like, it was at the end of the day and I was tired, I would just read more of them. So I burned through those pretty quickly. I liked them a lot. And you get a fair amount of like alignment ideas out of the sequences. Yeah. So that was pretty formative. And then just sort of, anytime I talked to Daniel about it, he would have interesting ideas. Yeah. So I think that, I think mostly what happened is I got nerd sniped by him because
That's what he said as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think he really appealed to the side of me that wanted to do sort of math and logic, and he was like, well, hey, sort of decision theory or formal epistemology, these in their essence are just mathematical theories of how reasoning ought to work. And I was like, wow, that's pretty sweet, because I like math, I like logic because I think it's has something to do with reasoning. This all seems pretty neat. And so he started to get me sort of more interested in decision theory, formal epistemology, that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think that was probably the initial bit. After that, I think that the project on Cartesian frames like really got me interested. I think that was probably the first time that I considered alignment as like a research option for myself.
And that's whilst you were writing this paper, whilst you were co-authoring this paper?
So really before we started co-authoring the paper, because we read Scott's sequence on the alignment forum, in its entirety before we even thought about writing the paper. And so actually I remember this one distinctly. So we were at Clara and Carver's house for like a game night, and we were talking about research in between playing games because we're insufferable and we can't stop talking about research. And I had mentioned that I'd been studying category theory and had worked through a textbook and was on to the second one, and I really liked it. I still really like it. I think it's a great branch of math. And so I had mentioned that, and Daniel was like, oh, hey, I just saw this sequence on the alignment forum that's, a framework for decision theory to be used for AI alignment, but it uses a lot of category theory, and I don't understand category theory. So why don't you and I work through the sequence together, and I'll supply the knowledge about rationality, you supply the knowledge about category theory, and we'll make sense of it. And so we spent winter quarter of last year meeting once a week, and each week we'd have worked through one of the posts in the sequence, and we came with our notes and questions, both mathematical and conceptual, about what was going on. And as we worked through it, we got convinced that it was actually, a really cool formalism, and that it should be used for things in decision theory, and that it might be of some use to philosophers. But we knew that philosophers wouldn't be on the alignment forum, obviously. And so Daniel had the idea of reaching out to Scott and asking if we could co-author a paper to try to put into a philosophy journal to sort of get it out to a wider audience, because we think it's worthwhile. So then we spent the next couple of months writing the paper after Scott okayed that idea.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice. And it was during that time that you were, was that the period that you were kind of mostly realigning your research interests and shifting your focus onto AI alignment, away from philosophy of mathematics?
Sort of. I think it was sort of the beginning of the process. I don't think that I really consciously decided that I would prefer to do alignment until maybe this past summer.
Okay.
But definitely at that time, in doing that project, I was like, oh, well, it turns out that my skill set would allow me to do some projects in this field. I just sort of assumed the alignment was not the sort of thing I could do because I don't have a computer science background. And I have part of a math background. So I just assumed it wasn't for me. But that project convinced me that there are questions that I would be able to make some sort of contribution to. So that was really exciting. So then I kept reading sort of posts on the alignment forum. I read Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. I read Stuart Russell's Human Compatible. I liked that. And just sort of anything on Less Wrong that looked interesting. I spent a lot of time doing that. And yeah, I think over the course of the next few months, it sort of came to dominate my interests more and more. I would just spend more time of the day thinking about it than I would about philosophy of math. Yeah, and I think it was this summer that I was like, it seems like I just spend a lot more time thinking about alignment than I do anything else, and so maybe I should just make it explicitly a research interest of mine.
Okay.
Or sort of the main research interest.
So, yeah, the main reasons then, so the main reasons it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, is that just this area is, it appeals to kind of, I don't really know how to explain this well. So yeah, it's got very little or nothing perhaps to do with the ethics of long-termism and kind of these people arguing about kind of why this matters so much from an ethical point of view. It's more to do with your own academic interests, what you're...
Yeah, definitely initially. Yeah, I think the importance of alignment was sort of lost on me for the first while. I'm now convinced of it, and so now I want to do alignment research, both because I find it interesting and because I think it's important, and I think that the importance should definitely be stressed by people. I think that's a good way to get people interested. But definitely for me at first, it was an academic interest. It was just cool theory. I liked it a lot.
And separate question, was your relationship with Daniel an important factor in getting you interested in AI alignment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't have heard about it if I didn't know Daniel. And I think I probably wouldn't have taken it seriously as a research interest if it weren't for him sort of constantly talking about it, not because he necessarily wanted to get me in. I mean, eventually he wanted to get me into it, but at first I think he was just talking about it because he just was interested. He cares about it. And so having someone around who knows a lot about alignment and can explain the ideas in a way that are intuitive and appealing and can tell you why they're important, can tell you why they're interesting to research. This is really valuable because I think that sort of taps into the research side of me as a PhD student, right? It was it's just cool to hear about good research topics. So I think, yeah, knowing Daniel was crucial.
And do you have any other take on how effective altruists can convince others to work on AI alignment?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this too because I also want to convince people to work on it. One way that I've been testing out sort of my ability to do this is sort of when people ask what I do, I now say AI research instead of math or philosophy of math. And they inevitably sort of want me to elaborate. And so I've been trying to figure out what's the best way to convey what it is that alignment research is about and what makes it different from other branches of AI. And I feel like this elevator pitch might be kind of helpful in getting people interested because you want to convey a problem that is both interesting, sounds solvable, and isn't too far-fetched, right? So I think that, like, at least when I first approached the field, I was hit by a lot of scenarios that sounded very sci-fi to me, and this is because I had, not thought about AI very much, like the average person. But so when I got told about ideas like, like a paperclip tiler, or like, putting the AI in a box won't work, or like, what if you have an AI that becomes deceitful, or things like that. At first, because I had never thought about this, I was like, these sound kind of crazy and mostly like science fiction. And if people are doing research on this, I kind of don't see why I would bother. Like, it doesn't sound like it's really going to happen. Now I think the scenarios are much more plausible. There's like that initial hurdle of kind of getting into the field. Like, if you don't have that background, it all sounds a bit kind of wacky. So instead, when I present it to people, I say things like, well, we already have instances of ML models that do weird things when they're presented with novel scenarios, right? So I give this example that I think I heard from a podcast interview with Stuart Russell of a self-driving car that was trained, this vision model was trained on data sets which included both pedestrians and cyclists, but it had no data for people walking next to their bikes. And so there was, sorry buddy, there was a car that was driving and was going by a woman walking her bike across the street, and the vision system kept jumping back and forth between trying to decide if it was a cyclist or a pedestrian, and it couldn't make a decision, and so it did nothing and just ran her over and killed her. If I remember correctly, those are the details. But so, I mean, this is at least hypothetically a really plausible scenario, and so I present this to people as like, well, you want to design ML systems which don't freak out when they go off of their training distribution. Another good one is like, you want ML models which actually understand what humans want and don't do things like reward hacking. And reward hacking is pretty easy, right? I mean, my girlfriend Sarah and I just had an example of this the other day where we're training our puppy, and he does this thing that lots of puppies do, where he likes to bite everything. He also won't sit still. He likes to bite everything, and so in particular when we're getting dressed, he likes to bite the legs of our pants, because it's just cloth flowing around in front of his face. He's excited. So Sarah was trying to train him not to do this, and so what she did is every time he bit, she would say, no, leave it. He already knows the command, leave it. So she would say, leave it. He would let go, and he would sit and wait patiently, and she would give him a treat.
Nice.
Yeah, it's great. And so it looks like we're training him not to bite the pant legs. But what actually happened is then he realized he could just bite the pant legs and listen to us when we said leave it, and then he would get a treat. And so for the last 3 days, he won't stop biting our pants. And so stuff like this happens all the time, right? Like, just really natural reward hacking because you didn't think about the way you're specifying the utility. And so I think giving grounded examples like this make the problem a lot more like a lot clearer for people or a lot more plausible, right? Like I think that in the times when I've tried to be like, well, imagine a paperclip Tyler, I lose people really quickly because they're like, okay, I didn't want a Star Trek example. I wanted, you know, what would something like Google do? Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, that's really good. Good answer to the question. And then finally, I just want to dive a bit deeper into your own research for those that are interested. Is there a specific approach you're taking to the alignment problem at the moment? Any particular research focus? Or is it too early to tell and you're just building up the relevant skills?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell because I'm building up relevant skills. Like my background in math is not super helpful for alignment research. Well, I guess in some ways it is. So a lot of like MIRI style research is very mathematical logic based. And I think this is a relative advantage for me over people with computer science backgrounds because I studied mathematical logic, so things like model theory and proof theory are pretty normal for me. Whereas things like probability and measure theory or statistics or computational complexity are things that I'm still catching up on. So that's true. I think in general I'm kind of a bit more interested in the probability and statistics approaches, which is a little unfortunate given my background, so I'm working through that. But I guess like the things which interest me, so at first things which interested me were like sort of the logical X issues that you see in a lot of like MIRI and alignment forum posts, like logical uncertainty, issues with logical omniscience, logical induction. I think these interested me at first. I kind of now, it seems like these are not problems that are not with logic, but just with uncertainty in general. Like, I no longer think that logical uncertainty is any different from normal uncertainty. And Daniel got Scott to verify this in a meeting of our reading group.
And he did?
He did, yeah. He was like, yeah, no, you're right. It's not about logic. The basic idea is just sort of like, usually when you set up logical uncertainty, you're like, well, Bayesian agents are required to know the consequences of all of their beliefs, logical consequences. But this is just not true if your sample space is populated by impossible worlds, which is what they use in the logical induction paper, right? So then it's the case that the set of worlds of like some consequence are not properly contained by the set of worlds of its antecedent, right? So it's not really about logic, which is fine. So yeah, I guess the things that I recently did the research Hamming questions from John Wentworth on Lasseron. I was kind of surprised by the results of just me thinking about it, but I think the things that interest me most are, sort of like how do you get ML models to generalize reliably from their training data to novel situations so that they won't freak out. And it seems like this is some combination of like how do you get sort of the appropriate generalizations, or you might call them like concepts, right? Is there a way to make this happen reliably? And then something like corrigibility seems important, like getting models to be receptive to corrections by controllers, like human controllers. So those are two things that I'm interested in. I think the general pattern is just sort of like, I'm really interested in the reasoning side, right? So the like embedded agency branch of agent foundations. So for example, I'm currently working through Vanessa Kosoy's infra-Bayesianism sequence. And I like this a lot. I think learning theory is something that I should go look at next. I think that's something I could see myself working on.
Great. Cool. So yeah, that's all my questions.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for the interview.
Yeah, no problem.
And
Johnny, what are you doing?